Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on, well, a really crucial exploration. One that asks us to look beyond just the surface-level assumptions to truly understand a deeply entrenched societal challenge. Our mission in this deep dive is to meticulously examine the complex and, frankly, often counterintuitive ways poverty is not only perpetuated, but in some cases, systemically capitalized upon. We're looking at legal and social structures, both here in the U.S. and globally. We've drawn insights from a pretty comprehensive stack of sources. We've got analyses from the Vera Institute of Justice, some powerful perspectives from the New Press, a revealing look from Poverty for Profit, critical reviews in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and the expansive global data from the World Bank. Each of these offers a unique lens, and by weaving them together, we really aim to build a more holistic picture of this incredibly complex issue. So as we dive in, here's the central question for you, our listener, to consider. How do existing systems often designed with perhaps the best intentions, inadvertently create what our sources are calling a poverty industrial complex, a system that profits from misery? And crucially, what does this mean for finding genuine, lasting solutions to poverty and hunger around the world? Okay, let's start by unpacking a truly, eye-opening insight from the Vera Institute of Justice. The research reveals that poverty isn't just a state of being. It's become, quite disturbingly, an actual pathway into the criminal legal system in the United States. It's a stark reality, and it challenges how many of us typically think about crime and poverty.
Exactly. And when we talk about the criminalization of poverty, we're not suggesting that poor individuals are somehow inherently more criminal. That's not the point at all. Instead, it's about how specific laws and practices are applied in ways that disproportionately impact those experiencing poverty. It's essentially treating their very existence or their attempts to survive as criminal acts rather than addressing the fundamental socioeconomic causes, the root issues that lead to their circumstances. The Vera Institute identifies 4 key areas where this plays out particularly acutely. Each one is, quite revealing.
And the first insight they highlight is the shocking reality of how homelessness itself is being criminalized. This isn't about major offenses, right? It's about making basic survival activities, things most of us just take for granted, illegal in public spaces. What does that actually look like, on the ground?
It looks like a system that actively punishes people simply for lacking a home. Local governments are increasingly enacting laws that make it illegal for unhoused individuals to engage in activities as fundamental as sitting, sleeping, or even just resting in public. Think about it. Laws banning panhandling, loitering, living in vehicles, or even something as basic as sharing food and water in public spaces. These aren't just isolated ordinances, they're part of a widespread punitive pattern. Authorities will eject people from public spaces, they confiscate and often destroy their meager property, and then, disturbingly, they might transport them to mass shelters or sometimes even straight to jails. These practices directly threaten their health, their well-being, and ultimately their lives. They trap them in an environment of constant vulnerability when they're already at their most precarious point.
Right. And the data shows this isn't a new thing or just happening in a few places. It's actually a growing nationwide trend. It's not just a local quirk. It seems like a systemic shift across the country.
Absolutely. The National Homelessness Law Center found a really significant and widespread increase in these types of citywide bans across the United States, looking at the period between 2006 and 2019. The statistics are quite telling. Citywide bans on camping, they surged by an astonishing 92% in that period. Prohibitions on just sitting or lying in public increased by 78%. Bans on loitering and panhandling, each of those jumped by 103%. And, maybe most strikingly, citywide bans on living in vehicles escalated by a staggering 213%. And these new laws, they continue to be implemented even as the underlying affordable housing crisis just gets worse, leaving more and more people with literally no alternative but to exist in public spaces, making them targets for this kind of criminalization.
So from a practical standpoint, does criminalizing homelessness actually work? I mean, what are the true, maybe unintended consequences? For individuals, sure, but also for the wider community, beyond just pushing the problem out of sight, I guess.
Yeah, that's a crucial question. And the short answer is no, it doesn't work. These laws are inherently discriminatory. They pose direct threats to the health, well-being, and the very lives of unhoused individuals. They trap them in this cycle of fines, arrests, and deeper instability. The core issue, as the Vera Institute clearly points out, is not a lack of places to enforce laws, but a fundamental affordable housing crisis. Instead of addressing the lack of safe, accessible, and affordable housing, we resort to these punitive measures. And here's the crucial, often overlooked insight, the one that really defies common assumptions about cost effectiveness. Creating affordable housing and providing essential supportive services has been repeatedly proven to cost less than the whole multifaceted process of criminalizing homelessness. Think about the costs involved: policing, arrests, incarceration, emergency room visits for untreated health issues that escalate, emergency shelters. It all adds up. In reality, these punitive measures are often a significant drain on public resources, and at the same time, they completely fail to address the problem at its root. They actually worsen the humanitarian aspect of the crisis.
That's a powerful point, and one that's often missed, I think. It really makes you wonder why we continue down a path that's both ineffective and apparently more costly. Okay, so moving from the streets into the literal justice system, the next area you mentioned is the money bail system. This seems to create a literal two-tiered system of justice based purely on someone's economic status.
It undeniably does, and it's one of the most, frankly, egregious examples of the criminalization of poverty. The money bail system ensures that legally innocent individuals, not yet convicted of anything, remain incarcerated pre-trial simply because they cannot afford the required payment, while at the same time, those with financial means can effectively purchase their liberty and return to their lives while they await trial. The scale of this problem is immense. On any given day in the U.S., more than 2/3 of the people in jail, that's over 400,000 individuals, are unconvicted. They're stuck behind bars just waiting for their day in court. And most of them are there solely due to their inability to pay bail, which often amounts to thousands of dollars. They might spend days, months, sometimes even years in jail for this reason alone.
And given that a 2022 Federal Reserve Board study found that 37% of Americans would struggle with just a $400 emergency expense, well, it's not hard to see how a bail amount in the thousands would be completely out of reach for a huge segment of the population. It just reinforces this two-tier system. It's not just about a few dollars, is it? It's literally about someone's entire life potentially unraveling, all because they can't afford a bail amount that for someone else might just be pocket change. That's a staggering reality.
Exactly. The financial vulnerability of such a large portion of the American population makes the money bail system a direct mechanism for punishing poverty. And the consequences for low-income individuals and those experiencing poverty are just devastating. They ripple through every aspect of their lives. They face significantly longer jail stays, which in turn intensifies the pressure on them to plead guilty, even if they genuinely believe they're innocent, simply to secure their release. It's coercive. This often leads to a higher likelihood of conviction, regardless of the actual strength of the evidence against them. And the long-term harm extends far beyond the courtroom. Research indicates that even a mere 2 days in jail can significantly increase the likelihood of someone losing their job, their housing, or even custody of their children. So far from enhancing public safety, our cash bail system is actually counterproductive. It destabilizes communities and cycles individuals through this ineffective and harmful system.
But there are places moving away from this, right? Showing that public safety can be maintained without relying so heavily on cash bail. What are the results we're seeing from those reforms?
Yes, absolutely. There are promising reforms demonstrating viable alternatives. States that have limited or entirely eliminated the use of cash bail, like New Jersey, for instance, have consistently shown that court appearance rates have remained steady, or in some cases even improved. This clearly demonstrates that bail is not, in fact, necessary to ensure people appear in court. And significantly, in September 2023, Illinois made history. They became the first state in the nation to entirely eliminate cash bail, deciding that someone's ability to pay should absolutely not be the determinant of whether or not they remain in jail before trial. These examples provide clear pathways for broader reform, emphasizing that, justice shouldn't be contingent on wealth.
Okay, moving on from bail, the Vera Institute next highlights the proliferation of fines and fees. Now, this sounds like it could trap people in just an endless cycle of debt, maybe even for really minor infractions, making it nearly impossible for them to escape poverty once they're caught in this particular system. How does this system function to sort of ensnare individuals?
It absolutely does, and it's a particularly insidious component of how poverty is both criminalized and, frankly, exploited for revenue. As the criminal legal system has expanded over recent decades, so too have the sheer number and types of financial burdens imposed on individuals. You have fines, which are imposed as a monetary punishment once a case is resolved, typically through a plea or conviction. But then you have fees. Fees exist purely to collect money for government operations. And critically, people can incur these fees even without being convicted of any offense. Consider the examples: court-appointed attorney fees, jail booking and processing fees, jail boarding fees, even drug testing fees. These aren't just minor administrative costs. They can quickly accumulate to hundreds or even thousands of dollars, sometimes for very minor offenses like traffic violations or petty infractions.
And the illogical consequences of not being able to pay. It seems like it creates a vicious cycle, where the inability to pay just makes the problem worse, rather than resolving anything. Can you elaborate on these compounding penalties?
Precisely. The system is almost designed to penalize the inability to pay. Not being able to cover these initial fines and fees leads, quite illogically, to more fines, more fees, and potentially even jail time. It's a debt spiral. For instance, several states have policies that suspend driver's licenses for unpaid debt, a move that is incredibly counterproductive if the goal is actually collecting revenue. Such suspensions make it significantly harder, if not impossible, for individuals to get to work, to secure new employment, or even attend job training. So it directly impedes their ability to earn income and pay off the very debt they're being penalized for. It makes no sense. People caught in this trap frequently report having to forego basic necessities like food or missing rent or car payments just to cover their court-related fines and fees. They're forced to choose between basic survival and legal compliance.
And from a purely pragmatic standpoint, do these fines and fees even work as effective revenue generators for the government? Or are they maybe creating more costs than they actually recoup?
Studies strongly suggest they often do not work as effective revenue generators. Recent research indicates that fines and fees are a really ineffective way to raise public revenue. In fact, some jurisdictions have found they've spent as much or sometimes even more just attempting to collect this criminal legal system debt, including the significant costs associated with jailing people who couldn't pay, than they actually managed to recoup from the fines and fees themselves. So it's an inefficient system that creates immense social harm for minimal, if any, economic gain for the public coffers. It's fiscally unsound as well as being socially unjust. Thankfully, there are some signs of change, although it's slow. New Mexico, for example, took a significant step by eliminating criminal court fees for adults in June 2023. That's a move that begins to break this deeply ingrained cycle of debt.
Okay. And finally, the Vera Institute highlights the criminalization of mental health crises, which also seems intrinsically linked to poverty. It sounds like jails have almost become default mental health institutions, which is, well, it's a problem for everyone involved, surely. How does this cycle intensify for those struggling with both poverty and mental health challenges?
It's a tragic and pervasive issue, and it really reveals a deep systemic failure in how we approach both poverty and mental health care. There's a deeply intertwined and cyclical relationship here. Living near or below the poverty line introduces chronic stressors, things like food insecurity, unstable housing, lack of health care, that significantly increase the risk of developing or exacerbating serious mental health conditions. Conversely, individuals with serious mental health conditions often face substantial barriers to finding and maintaining stable employment just due to the challenges posed by their illness. And this, in turn, can lead to or entrench them deeper in poverty. So you get this tragic feedback loop where poverty worsens mental health issues and mental health issues contribute to poverty, making access to vital mental health services and treatment incredibly difficult.
And the criminal justice system just becomes the default response instead of healthcare or community support. Some people end up in jail for behavior that really stems from a health crisis rather than getting the treatment they actually need.
Unfortunately, yes, that's often what happens. In the absence of adequate community-based treatment services, local jails have become these de facto mental health institutions, which, frankly, they're completely ill-equipped to be. People with mental health conditions are incarcerated at disproportionate rates, often for nonviolent, minor offenses that are actually symptomatic of their illness, things like disorderly conduct, loitering, or trespassing. A 2017 report from the U.S. Department of Justice revealed that a staggering 44% of people in jail have a history of mental illness. 44%. Yet behind bars, the specialized resources and the comprehensive services needed to address these complex health issues are sorely lacking. So it often leads to a worsening of conditions rather than actual treatment. Incarceration is just. It's a far cry from an appropriate or adequate response. It's a punitive and ineffective approach to what is fundamentally a public health problem. The proposed solution is pretty clear. Communities need to divest from this punitive approach and invest significantly in comprehensive services, including things like civilian-led crisis response programs. These programs are demonstrably better equipped to respond safely, effectively, and humanely to individuals experiencing a mental health crisis. They provide care rather than punishment and actually address the root of the issue.
Right. So what we've just uncovered in the U.S. justice system reveals this really disturbing pattern. But our sources suggest this isn't just a collection of isolated injustices. It might be symptoms of something far larger, something more deeply entrenched, a system that, chillingly, may actually rely on poverty to sustain itself. This is what our sources are terming the poverty industrial complex. That phrase itself is quite striking.
It is, and this is a critical pivot in our understanding, moving from looking at individual systemic failures to trying to grasp an overarching framework. The poverty industrial complex, or PAC, as defined by Bob Pfeiffer in Revealing the Poverty Industrial Complex, Profiting from Misery, is described as a vast and intricate network. It encompasses government agencies, a multitude of nonprofit organizations, private corporations, and even media entities. All of these, in various ways, apparently benefit from the existence and perpetuation of poverty. This benefit can manifest in different ways. High-paying jobs for those working within the system, the bureaucratic growth of the organizations themselves, the availability of cheap labor derived from marginalized populations, or even just perpetuating stereotypes about the poor that justify the system's existence and its expansion. And it's probably important to clarify the relationship between this broader poverty industrial complex and the welfare industrial complex. The latter is really a specific subset of the PAC. It refers primarily to the network of government agencies, private contractors, and service providers directly involved in administering traditional welfare programs, things like cash transfers, food stamps, housing assistance. It's focused on the direct provision of social safety net services. But then Shams de Baron, who's a housing rights advocate with powerful lived experience, introduces another crucial term within this framework, the shelter industrial complex. This is described as a specific manifestation of the PIC, particularly evident within the context of homelessness in New York City. He argues that entities within this complex profit directly from homelessness while offering very few genuine pathways to permanent housing. de Baron also coins the term poverty pimping. It's a provocative term, but he uses it to describe how individuals and organizations can build careers and amass wealth by presenting themselves as solutions to poverty, but in reality, he argues, they actively sustain it rather than genuinely solving it. They become reliant on the very problem they claim to address.
It's quite sobering to consider that this system, as our sources describe it, apparently has deep historical roots, stemming from efforts that were, perhaps, initially well-intentioned. This is some recent development, but the gradual systemic evolution over decades, how did we get here?
Absolutely. Pfeiffer traces the modern poverty industrial complex back about 60 years to President Lyndon B. Johnson's declaration of the War on Poverty back in 1963. That era gave rise to the ambitious Great Society programs, which developed vital initiatives like housing assistance, food stamps, child nutrition programs, Medicaid, and so on. Over time, nonprofit organizations and private corporations also became deeply involved, securing substantial government grants to administer these programs, deliver services like school lunches, construct shelters, and supply various forms of aid. It quickly became, as Pfeiffer describes it, big business, fostering an entire industry around poverty alleviation, or perhaps management. And Pfeiffer notes a key societal shift occurred alongside this. He suggests citizens gradually absolved themselves of direct worry about the poor. The prevailing sentiment became something like, well, I pay my taxes, maybe I give a few dollars to charity, that's enough done. People started relying on this burgeoning poverty industrial complex to handle things, effectively outsourcing the responsibility for poverty alleviation to this growing professional apparatus. de Baron provides a more specific historical account for New York City, illustrating how local policy decisions really contributed to this complex. He points to the 1970s and 80s, which saw a dramatic decline in affordable housing options, notably the disappearance of single-room occupancy units, or SROs. These were once a vital resource for low-income New Yorkers, but they vanished due to urban renewal policies and zoning changes. This dismantling of affordable housing, he argues, laid the fundamental groundwork for the city's current housing crisis and, by extension, inadvertently birthed this multi-billion-dollar shelter industry. Then a pivotal moment arrived with the 1981 Callahan v. Carey consent decree. This established New York's unique right to shelter. While undoubtedly protective for homeless individuals, this landmark decision inadvertently created a system that primarily focused on expanding emergency shelters rather than aggressively tackling the root cause of homelessness, the severe and persistent lack of affordable housing. The situation was further exacerbated, according to de Baron, in 1992 when Andrew Cuomo, then a future governor, authored a report recommending transferring shelter operations from government agencies to nonprofit providers. He called this process non-profitization, while perhaps intended to improve conditions, de Baron argues this move ultimately created a vast network of organizations whose operations and financial stability became directly dependent on maintaining homeless populations, thereby creating a kind of vested interest in the continuation of the problem itself.
So despite all these maybe good intentions and certainly billions and billions of dollars spent, the consequence seems to be a profound failure to actually end poverty. The numbers you mentioned earlier are quite stark, indicating a system that's growing but not really achieving its stated purpose. What are the key takeaways from our sources regarding the effectiveness or lack thereof of this complex?
They are stark indeed. Pfeiffer highlights a crucial and, frankly, disheartening point. Despite the billions spent and the vast growth of this poverty industrial complex, the U.S. poverty rate has remained stubbornly flat for decades. In 1968, the poverty rate was 12.4%. In 2022, it was 11.5%. It's fluctuated a bit between maybe 15.1% and 10.5%, but basically flat since 1968. Yet, over that same period, federal spending, adjusted for inflation, skyrocketed. It went from under $500 per person in poverty to over $16,000 per person. And that figure doesn't even include the millions, probably billions, spent by nonprofits supporting the poor. So the poverty industrial complex has grown exponentially, consuming vast sums, but the fundamental poverty rate has remained, as Pfeiffer puts it, flat as a pancake. The main consequence seems to be that the system, as it operates, doesn't really lead people to financial independence. It provides aid, it hands out benefits, which might make daily life easier in the short term, yes, but Pfeiffer argues it crucially takes away the responsibility for the poor to provide for themselves. This, he argues, injures dignity and too often leads to stagnation and isolation rather than genuine progress. The central failing he identifies in the poverty industrial complex is its core assumption that people primarily need tangible handouts, food, housing, school lunches, phone subsidies, preschool to stabilize their lives so that they can then focus on improving themselves. It focuses narrowly on these material needs, he says, neglecting critical human needs for things like emotional support, skill development, and life coaching, which are essential for long-term self-sufficiency.
And it seems the public, including maybe even those experiencing poverty themselves, recognizes this fundamental flaw. They seem to express a desire for something more than just handouts. What does the data tell us about their perspectives?
That's right. The public opinion data collected by Pfeiffer is quite revealing and seems to support this critique. A significant 63% of people currently receiving welfare benefits told him they don't think the war on poverty has succeeded. Furthermore, a substantial 83% of those in poverty believe that a work requirement or job training should be attached to receiving welfare benefits. That indicates a strong desire for active engagement and pathways to self-sufficiency, rather than just passive receipt of aid. Pfeiffer even quotes a young black woman in poverty who, when asked about the biggest problem facing poor people, directly stated, "poverty pimps." It echoes de Baron's earlier observation and points to this perceived exploitative nature of some parts of the system. And this leads directly to what appears to be a significant misallocation of resources and problematic profit motives within the system. Daniel L. Hatcher's important book, The Poverty Industry, reviewed by Angela Glover Blackwell, really unveils how states and municipalities, often working with private contractors, have apparently transformed a range of vulnerable populations, including abused and neglected children, disabled youth, the elderly, poor, impoverished families, into sources of income. This money is then reportedly siphoned off for cash-strapped agencies' budgets, general government funds, and corporate coffers, rather than actually serving the intended beneficiaries.
Right, like the notorious example that came out of Ferguson, Missouri, where court fines and fees became a major revenue source for the city, directly impacting the most vulnerable residents. It's almost like a reverse Robin Hood, taking from the poor to fund the system itself.
Exactly. Before that legal settlement with the U.S. Department of Justice, court fines and fees were apparently the Ferguson city government's second largest source of income. This system directly targeted the poor for revenue extraction, rather than focusing on justice or public safety. Hatcher also provides an especially, egregious example from the foster care system. He reports that foster care agencies collectively take over $250 million annually in Social Security survivor benefits that belong to children in their care. Instead of using these funds for the child's direct benefit, say, to help with their transition out of foster care at age 18, the agencies incorporate the money into their own operating budgets. Some agencies even hire contractors specifically to optimize this extraction of funds from vulnerable children. Hatcher sharply observes that if a foster parent or social worker were to pocket a child's benefits for their own use, it would rightly be called theft. Yet foster care agencies claim this practice somehow advances the greater good by adding to their fiscal capacity for improved services. However, Hatcher demonstrates that much of this money ends up in state general funds, not directly devoted to the children in need. And private contractors take a significant cut, which really undermines that greater good argument.
That's an incredibly powerful observation. It really makes you wonder how we as a society can justify such a double standard when it's cloaked in institutional practice. It truly speaks to the potentially perverse incentives at play here.
And in New York City's shelter system, DeBaron exposes what he sees as a similar troubling reality. A Crain's New York business investigation revealed that 14 nonprofit organizations each hold contracts worth over $1 billion in taxpayer money. The disparity in compensation is glaring. Some executives at these organizations reportedly earn upward of $800,000 annually. That's more than triple the mayor's salary, while many frontline shelter workers earn minimum wage or just slightly above. This wage gap, DeBaron argues, reflects systemic flaws in how homeless services are funded, where government contracts often fail to allocate adequate resources for those direct service roles. Shelters, he also claims, tend to overspend on security measures, creating a kind of prison-like atmosphere rather than a supportive one, and provide inhumane quality food. These are often framed as cost-cutting measures, but he argues they actually serve to pad bottom lines and justify executive bonuses. The focus shifts, he says, from solving homelessness to simply maintaining high bed counts because that justifies continued funding and, well, profit.
And this profit motive, or even just bureaucratic self-preservation, seems to breed a stifling bureaucracy and inefficiency, as well as a lack of true accountability for actual outcomes. It sounds like a complex web that just perpetuates itself. What are some of those striking examples of this inefficiency that our sources point out?
It absolutely seems to create a self-serving cycle. Pfeiffer highlights the sheer bureaucratic maze of the federal welfare system in the U.S. There's no single department of welfare. Instead, you have 8 federal agencies operating 13 separate welfare programs, each with its own distinct rules and qualification standards. This lack of centralization creates an incredibly frustrating and burdensome system for the people trying to navigate it. It leads to many unintended consequences, like a marriage penalty where benefits might be reduced if individuals marry, and exceptionally high administrative costs just to run the thing. The poverty-industrial complex, in this sense, has no sensitivities, Pfeiffer says, to the time and skill it takes to manage such a complex system. It simply dictates rules and expects users to somehow adapt to its convoluted structure. He offers the Lifeline program, which is a $9.25 monthly phone subsidy for low-income households, as an almost absurd example of government for government's sake. This modest annual benefit, less than $120 per household per year, requires this complex application and qualification process. It involves telecommunication companies, the FCC, databases, reports, audits, all this machinery. Pfeiffer points out, quite reasonably I think, that we could achieve the same economic effect for users by simply raising SNAP, or food stamp, amounts by $10 a month. That would avoid all this bureaucratic overhead. But then, he notes rightly, the FCC would miss out on the welfare game. It's almost comically inefficient if it weren't for the serious implications for people's lives. Pfeiffer also critiques the Housing First initiative. This policy advocates for putting people in temporary and permanent housing regardless of their circumstances, including addiction or mental illness. Now, while studies often show how well the system works on a case-by-case basis for individuals placed in housing, he argues that these studies often don't look at the community as a whole, whereby homelessness remains a problem. He cites Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco as examples, cities that spend far more on homelessness than most communities, yet their homeless problems are described as acute and growing. This, he claims, perpetuates a cycle where more buildings, salaries, grants, studies, and experts are continuously needed, further entrenching the complex rather than solving the underlying issue. And as for nonprofit accountability, Pfeiffer points out that many charities apparently don't grade themselves on the true progress of the poor. For example, if a food bank's success is measured primarily by how much food it hands out, it justifies its growth, its salaries, its fundraising efforts, without necessarily prompting genuine life change or leading people towards financial independence. He emphasizes the well-known saying about giving a man a fish versus teaching him to fish, asserting that most food banks make no attempt to do the really heavy lifting of getting to know their users and attempting to truly change lives. If people simply come by and take the food, it serves as proof to them that they are an important service and justify their existence and growth. He calls this self-serving compassion, where compassion is measured at the giver's intent, having a big heart and giving stuff away is enough, rather than by the receiver's actual progress and advancement toward a better life. It's easy, he implies, to throw a few dollars at a problem. Much harder to do the difficult, long-term work of truly helping someone change their circumstances.
And when critics emerge, especially those who've actually lived through these systems, the system seems to respond by trying to silence them, maintaining a kind of harmful power dynamic. How does this system manage to push back against calls for genuine change?
That's a critical and frankly disturbing aspect of this poverty-industrial complex, as described by our sources. De Baron explicitly states that the system actively tries to silence and discredit those who speak out against it. They get labeled as service-resistant or troublemakers. He draws a powerful historical parallel, comparing this tactic to when 19th century doctors invented the fake diagnosis of drapetomania to label enslaved people who sought freedom as mentally ill. It's a way of pathologizing dissent. This silencing mechanism, he argues, serves to protect the status quo and the financial interests of those who profit from the perpetuation of poverty. By discrediting critics, those who benefit from the current system can maintain their grip on services, resources, and funding streams. Furthermore, De Baron highlights the stark racial dynamics that are often at play within this system. While Black and brown communities disproportionately bear the brunt of homelessness, largely due, he says, to generations of gentrification and discriminatory housing policies, the leadership of many homeless services organizations remains predominantly white and economically privileged. This creates a profound disconnect, where those most impacted by homelessness often have the least influence over potential solutions. Angela Glover Blackwell, in her review of Hatcher's book, also notes this as a crucial omission in Hatcher's work. She emphasizes that it's critical to explicitly call out which communities bear the greatest impact from these revenue-generating maneuvers, given that aid programs and systems disproportionately serve people of color. Implicit bias and institutional racism, she argues, often drive inequitable, even cynical government policies and practices that get cloaked as public service, further entrenching the problem along racial lines.
So what does all of this mean for those seeking genuine change? I mean, despite the deeply entrenched nature of these systems, our sources also seem to reveal pockets of resistance and some innovative alternatives emerging. It's not entirely a bleak picture, is it? There seem to be pathways forward. Where do we see hope for real transformation?
No, it's not entirely bleak. There has always been resistance to the poverty-industrial complex, though Feifel does note these voices have often been a minority and perhaps buried under the weight of ever-growing handouts from the established system. He uses the analogy that it's difficult to offer a hand up when the hands are full of handouts, indicating the challenge of empowering self-sufficiency when dependency is perhaps inadvertently reinforced by the system itself. However, there seems to be a growing awareness among the poor themselves that their true development, their path forward, needs to come from somewhere other than the traditional poverty-industrial complex. This realization has given rise to some new approaches from certain state, local, and nonprofit entities. These organizations seem to share a common philosophy. They work directly, often one-on-one with the poor, to help them develop financial independence. This is the heavy lifting Pfeiffer mentioned. It involves intensive and personalized support through things like life coaching, education, job training, and work initiatives. It's a long-term commitment, often taking years, but some organizations are taking on this challenge, shifting the focus from just temporary relief to sustainable self-efficiency.
And Shams De Baron, our source from Vital City, he is a powerful example of this resistance, isn't he? Using his own lived experience as a catalyst for systemic reform and demonstrating how real change can happen when those most affected are actually brought into the decision-making process. What specific changes has his advocacy helped bring about in New York City?
He certainly is a compelling example. Daburn's journey from experiencing homelessness himself to working directly with Mayor Eric Adams's administration on systemic reforms is incredibly significant. He highlights how listening to impacted advocates, individuals with that first-hand experience of homelessness, can drive meaningful and lasting change. A prime example he cites is the elimination of the 90-day rule in New York City. Previously, individuals were required to remain in shelter for 90 days before they could qualify for city AFUPS rental vouchers. This was a bureaucratic hurdle that often prolonged their homelessness unnecessarily. By ending this outdated policy, the administration, influenced by advocates like De Baron, has expanded eligibility for vital housing assistance. It really demonstrates that when systems genuinely listen to those who have experienced homelessness firsthand, concrete and impactful reform becomes achievable. Daburn's perspective on shelter providers has also evolved, interestingly. While he initially viewed them, perhaps understandably, as perpetrators of a flawed system, he now expresses an understanding that many operate within rigid governmental constraints. These constraints can hinder innovation and prioritize bureaucratic metrics over meaningful outcomes. He notes that some forward-thinking providers are now recognizing this limitation and are diversifying their approach. They're expanding into housing development and focusing more on permanent solutions rather than just providing temporary shelter. This shift marks a crucial step towards addressing the root causes of homelessness, not just managing its symptoms.
And he's actively trying to implement his vision with his own initiative, Lion Fox Development, focusing on creating both sensible housing and holistic shelters. It sounds like he's directly addressing the need for both quantity and quality in housing solutions. Can you tell us a bit more about these innovative models he's proposing?
Precisely. His initiative, Lion Fox Development, operates with two parallel missions, as he describes them. The first is creating what he calls sensible housing. This aims to expand affordable housing options by actively working to remove restrictive zoning barriers, an initiative supported by the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity in Newark. So, tackling the supply side. More innovatively, perhaps, his second mission involves developing holistic shelters. This reimagines emergency housing as something much more than just beds and meals. His model proposes replacing traditional congregate dorm-style facilities with individual secured smart pods. These would provide essential privacy and dignity, allowing residents to feel safe and maintain personal autonomy while they work towards stability. These smart pods would also be equipped with free Wi-Fi access, recognizing that internet connectivity is now an essential tool for completing education, searching for jobs, maintaining social connections, all vital for reintegration. And crucially, these holistic shelters would integrate comprehensive on-site services. This means immediate access right there to mental health support, job training programs, housing navigation assistance, financial literacy courses, cooking and nutrition education, even interpersonal communication skills training. The goal is to foster environments that truly nurture independence and growth. The measure of success for these shelters would shift dramatically. It wouldn't be about bed counts or meals served, but rather the effectiveness and rapidity of residents' transition into permanent housing, their long-term stability once they're in those homes, their employment levels, and their overall improved quality of life. Apparently, New York City has expressed interest in piloting this idea, which underscores its potential as a genuine catalyst for transformation. The core principle driving this vision, as De Baron eloquently states it, is that the solution to homelessness has always been homes.
Okay. Now, if we connect this back to the bigger picture, it becomes pretty clear that these domestic challenges we've been discussing are echoed in the global fight against poverty and hunger, particularly when we look at the effectiveness and structure of international aid. The World Bank offers a comprehensive look at this, highlighting similar systemic issues, but on a much larger scale. What are the current global trends in poverty and hunger, and how have recent crises impacted them?
Yes, the global context really does highlight strikingly similar complexities, and it underscores the critical need for more effective and sustainable solutions worldwide. The World Bank's analysis reveals that the COVID-19 pandemic represented the largest setback to global poverty reduction in at least 3 decades. It took a full 3 years just for global poverty levels to return to where they were before the pandemic struck. And the recovery has been deeply uneven. There were an estimated 23 million more people still living in extreme poverty in 2022 compared to 2019. And this extreme poverty is overwhelmingly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, where a staggering 6 out of 10 of the world's extreme poor reside. Global hunger trends are similarly concerning and show limited recovery after the pandemic. Between 691 and 783 million people faced hunger in 2022. That's a substantial increase, 122 million more people than in 2019 before the pandemic. And the projections indicate that hunger is expected to rise significantly in Africa by 2030. This grim outlook is driven by a confluence of intertwined crises. Slow growth prospects in many developing economies, persistent high inflation driving up the cost of living, high government debt limiting the fiscal space for development policies, rising fragility and conflict in various regions, and, of course, the escalating, exacerbating effects of climate change and extreme weather events. These interconnected challenges are severely hindering progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
So given these immense global challenges, what does the World Bank suggest for sustainable poverty and hunger alleviation on a global scale? It seems to revolve around this idea of an asset-based approach and focusing on evidence-based fiscal and market policies. Can you break down these high-value policy choices they recommend?
Precisely. The World Bank emphasizes what they call asset-based approaches. The idea is to sustainably tackle poverty by investing in the productive capacity of the poor rather than simply providing consumption-based aid. This approach is organized into 3 main buckets of high-value policy choices. First, high-value fiscal policies. This includes targeted investments in early childhood outcomes, things like primary education and non-contributory cash transfers, like Brazil's highly successful Bolsa Familia program. These yield high long-term value by significantly enhancing human capital. It also includes government spending that brings transformative economic growth, such as long-term investments in research and development, R&D, and infrastructure. Think historical successes like the Green Revolution in agriculture or improvements in rural connectivity and urban commuting. Lastly, it suggests that spending designed to directly address market failures is often more cost-effective and beneficial in the long run than broad subsidies. Subsidies tend to be poorly targeted, often disproportionately benefiting wealthier segments of the population, and they can potentially distort market incentives. The second bucket focuses on well-functioning labor and land markets, recognizing these as primary assets for the poor. For labor markets, the government's role is seen as creating the fundamental conditions for strong private sector-led growth, actively analyzing job market conditions, and identifying and removing constraints that prevent the creation of more and better jobs. This involves facilitating crucial job transitions, supporting shifts from agriculture to non-agricultural sectors, from rural to urban areas, from unskilled to skilled occupations, and from non-exporting to exporting activities. These transitions are identified as key to closing massive income gaps and combating poverty sustainably. In land markets, policies should prioritize providing tenure security for various land rights, private, customary, and common, especially for vulnerable groups like women and indigenous peoples, to improve their asset base. It also involves facilitating the low-cost exchange and distribution of land, and crucially, promoting sustainable land use to prevent negative environmental externalities and irreversible degradation. And the third bucket is household risk management. This combines the capacity to prepare for risks with the ability to cope effectively afterward, minimizing the permanent negative effects of transitory shocks, like drought or health crises. This involves four interlinked components. First, acquiring knowledge, like through basic literacy, media campaigns, access to mobile tech. Second, providing protection, like resilient infrastructure, preventive healthcare, property rights, especially for women. Third, offering robust insurance mechanisms like index insurance, health insurance, pensions. And the final component, coping, involves deploying resources effectively when shocks hit, like income support, adaptive social protection systems. These systems are crucial for preventing people from falling back into poverty permanently.
But even with these well-defined policies, the global aid landscape itself seems to present significant structural challenges. You mentioned complexity, fragmentation. How does this hinder overall effectiveness in reaching those most in need? How is this playing out in practice, and what are the consequences of this fragmented approach?
It absolutely does pose challenges. The global aid system has become increasingly complex over the last 2 decades, and this complexity hinders its efficiency and impact. You now have over 200 donor agencies operating. This leads to significant fragmentation of financial flows. For instance, from 2000 to 2021, what the World Bank calls official financial flows, or OF basically, all the money changing hands from donors to recipient countries, grew by about 218% in volume. But here's the kicker. The number of individual transactions surged by an astounding 427% during that same time. Think of it like someone giving out lots and lots of tiny checks instead of fewer bigger ones. This means the average grant size has effectively halved over this period, falling from around $1.7 million to just $0.8 million. For countries with weaker institutional capacities, this fragmentation translates into disproportionately higher transaction costs and an immense administrative burden. They have to manage relationships with hundreds of diverse agencies and navigate all these complex, disparate requirements. And a major issue is that the majority of aid funds increasingly circumvent recipient government budgets. By 2021, approximately 80% of these OFF projects were implemented by non-government entities, primarily through project-type interventions via NGOs or other multilateral organizations. Only about 40% of the overall OFF was channeled directly through national budgets. Now, this circumvention might sometimes be done to mitigate donor reputational risk or maybe achieve quick, visible results, but it challenges the fundamental effectiveness of aid. It limits recipient countries' ownership, their ability to align funds with their own national development goals, and crucially, their capacity to build and strengthen their own public financial management systems. Multilateral development banks, or MDBs, these are major financial institutions like the World Bank itself, or specifically its International Development Association, known as IDA. They are notable exceptions here. They directly allocate about 92% of their funds to government agencies, which helps build borrower country capacity and ensures adherence to rigorous fiduciary, environmental, and social standards. There's also been a significant growth in what's called earmarked aid. These are funds designated for specific sectors or themes, often channeled through vertical platforms, think dedicated funds for HIV/AIDS or climate change, for example. From 2000 to 2021, grant commitments from these vertical platforms increased an average of 27% annually. They grew 16-fold overall. Now, while these vertical approaches can be effective in tackling specific issues and achieving economies of scale, they often operate as unleveraged facilities. This means they essentially directly pass donor funds to recipients without mobilizing additional resources, limiting their overall financial impact. In stark contrast, horizontal platforms like ID operate as leveraged facilities. This means every donor dollar can be amplified into 3 or even 4 times the financing for the recipient country. This unique capability enables much greater resource mobilization and potentially much larger long-term impacts by integrating funds into broader country development strategies.
Okay, so how can we make global aid more effective, especially given these challenges of fragmentation and these different approaches, leveraged versus unleveraged? It sounds like there's a real need for a more coordinated and strategic global approach. What are the key recommendations emerging from these analyses, like from the G20 task force?
That's precisely the conclusion of the G20 task force. They offer several key recommendations to try and address these systemic issues. First, they say it's crucial to strive for a greater balance and complementarity between these leveraged and unleveraged approaches to aid delivery. This means finding ways to combine the advantages of both approaches while mitigating their limitations. The recommendation is to actively foster opportunities for co-financing and strategic partnerships between those vertical funds, the issue-specific ones, and the MDBs, the broader leveraged ones. By doing so, you could meet urgent financing needs for specific issues, achieve economies of scale, and mobilize scarce concessional resources more effectively for the broad benefit of developing countries. Second, to optimize the impact of those earmarked funds, the task force suggests integrating them more effectively into the horizontal framework of the MDBs, like IDEA. IDEA's unique hybrid financial model, as we discussed, has that remarkable capability to leverage each dollar of donor contribution by a multiple of 3 or 4. That significantly expands the overall envelope of resources available to developing countries for their broader development goals. So it maximizes the potential impact of every single dollar donated. Third, and perhaps most broadly, the recommendation is for the Global Alliance, the G20, and others to foster the development of a consensus among donors. A consensus to promote greater balance and complementarity between these different approaches. By integrating earmarked funds from unleveraged vertical facilities into the horizontal framework of the MDBs, it would be possible to harness the distinct advantages of both vertical, that issue-specific focus, and horizontal, addressing broader country needs approaches. This collaborative strategy could foster greater cooperation and help overcome the challenges posed by resource competition and fragmentation. Ultimately, the goal is to enable the mobilization of much greater resources to tackle global development challenges like hunger and poverty reduction more effectively and sustainably. It's really about moving from siloed efforts to a more unified, impactful global strategy.
So, pulling all of this together, what does it all mean? Our deep dive today really reveals a system, or maybe multiple interconnected systems, riddled with complex challenges. We've seen everything from the direct criminalization of poverty and the, perverse incentives within the poverty industrial complex, right through to the intricate fragmentation of global aid. Yet amidst all that, we've also seen glimpses of promising new directions. Through resistance, through lived experience driving innovation, and through shifts towards more evidence-based policy.
Yeah, I think our core insights from this exploration really illuminate several critical truths about the nature of poverty and our efforts to alleviate it. Firstly, it seems clear the U.S. criminal legal system disproportionately punishes poverty. It impacts individuals through the criminalization of homelessness, the fundamental injustice of money bail, the crushing debt traps created by fines and fees, and the inappropriate incarceration of individuals experiencing mental health crises. It's a system that seems to cycle the vulnerable further into hardship, not out of it. Secondly, we've identified this unsettling reality of the poverty industrial complex and its specific manifestation, the shelter industrial complex. These are described as profit-driven systems that, rather than fostering independence, may inadvertently perpetuate dependency, creating a kind of vested interest in the continuation of the very problem they purport to solve. Thirdly, it's become clear that genuine and lasting solutions require a pretty fundamental shift in approach. This seems to mean moving beyond mere handouts, beyond just managing the problem, to truly investing in individuals' assets, their skills, and their dignity, empowering them towards self-sufficiency. And this has to happen alongside comprehensive systemic policy reforms that actually dismantle the mechanisms that might profit from misery. Finally, on a global scale, international aid has to evolve. It needs to become more effective, address its inherent fragmentation, and channel funds transparently and strategically to build productive capacity within recipient nations. The aim has to be sustainable, self-driven development, not just temporary relief. So I guess the final thought, the provocative question perhaps, is this. Given the pervasive nature of systems that seem to inadvertently or sometimes directly profit from poverty, and considering the urgent global need for genuine progress, how can we as a society really shift our collective mindset and our policy frameworks? How do we move from merely managing poverty and its consequences to truly investing in and empowering individuals towards sustainable, independent lives? This question really underscores the profound societal reevaluation that seems required for genuine progress. It challenges all of us to look beyond immediate fixes towards deep, long-term systemic change.
We certainly hope this deep dive has provided you with some valuable insights and perhaps a clearer understanding of these incredibly critical issues. If you found this discussion thought-provoking, please consider subscribing to The Deep Dive, perhaps liking this particular deep dive and leaving a comment to share your own reflections or questions. Your engagement really helps us continue these important conversations. Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. We look forward to our next exploration with you.